My name is Zuri. I am 32 years old, and my in-laws spent years treating me like the family scapegoat. They were absolutely convinced I would never fight back against their constant humiliation. But when a long-buried truth came to light, their arrogance vanished, and everything they thought they knew about me changed forever. If you have ever been underestimated or pushed into the shadows by people who were supposed to be your family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you will want to hear exactly how I watched their fake empire burn to the ground. The crystal chandeliers of the Atlanta Heritage Gala cast a warm golden glow over the massive ballroom. This was the event of the season for the City High Society. It was a night dedicated to celebrating Black excellence, philanthropy, and generational wealth. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and custom designer gowns. Soft jazz music floated through the air, mixing with the clinking of champagne glasses and the polished laughter of politicians, judges, and business moguls. I stood near the center of the room wearing a simple but elegant black dress. For years, my role in my husband Dion's family was to be entirely invisible. They tolerated my presence because Dion insisted on bringing me, but they made sure I knew my exact place at the very bottom of their social hierarchy. I was just Zuri, the quiet girl who did freelance financial consulting from home. I did not have a famous last name. I did not pledge the right sorority in college. And according to my mother-in-law, Vivian, I brought absolutely no value to their pristine public image. Vivian was the reigning queen of this particular social circle. At 60 years old, she carried herself like royalty. She was a proud member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and a former president of the local Jack and Jill chapter. Her entire existence revolved around exclusive zip codes, designer labels, and making sure everyone knew the powerful legacy of her family. I was making my way toward our assigned VIP table near the front of the stage when she intercepted me. She stepped directly into my path, her expensive diamond necklace catching the light. Before I could even say hello, she reached out and physically snatched the VIP table placard right out of my hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the heavy cardstock like a weapon. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust, her eyes lingering on my unbranded dress. "The VIP tables are for the sponsors and real contributors, Zuri." She said, her voice a low, venomous whisper designed to humiliate me without drawing a scene. "A little freelance consultant like you sitting at our table is just going to ruin the aesthetic for the society photographers. Go find a seat in the back or make yourself useful." Before I could process the sheer audacity of her words, she shoved a black catering apron into my hands. It belonged to one of the event staff she must have cornered earlier. I stood there holding the cheap fabric, my heart pounding against my ribs. I looked past her shoulder to find my husband Dion. He was standing just a few feet away, holding a glass of bourbon, watching the entire exchange. Dion was 34 years old, a handsome graduate of a prestigious, historically Black college. When we first met, he presented himself as a warm, educated, and protective partner. I thought I had found a man who would stand by me through anything. But over the years, I learned the bitter truth. Dion was a coward. He was completely terrified of his mother and desperate for his family approval. He would gladly throw me under the bus if it meant keeping his place in Vivian's good graces. I met his eyes waiting for him to step forward, waiting for him to be a real husband, waiting for him to tell his mother that his wife would be sitting right beside him at the VIP table. Instead, Dion looked away. He shifted uncomfortably, took a sip of his drink, and then walked over and leaned in close to my ear. "Just do it, Zuri," he whispered, his voice trembling with pathetic anxiety. "Please do not embarrass my mother in front of her sorority sisters tonight. This event is too important for her image. Just put the apron on and stay out of the photos. I will make it up to you later, I promise." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The man who had vowed to protect me was asking me to play the role of the help, just so his mother could look good for the cameras. As if the moment was not degrading enough, my sister-in-law Dominique and her husband Terrence strolled past us. Dominique was the family golden child. She projected the image of a wealthy girl boss running a luxury cosmetics line. Terrence, her husband, posed as a high-rolling crypto wealth manager, They were dripping in designer brands from head to toe, completely obsessed with projecting an image of massive wealth. Dominique gave me a condescending smirk, looking at the catering apron in my hands. Terrence did not even bother to make eye contact. He simply held out his empty glass and actually snapped his fingers at me. "Be a good girl and fetch me a fresh bourbon Zuri," Terrence said smoothly, "and make sure they use the good ice this time." They walked away laughing, joining Vivian and Dion at the front table. They settled into their plush chairs, adjusting their expensive clothes, ready to be photographed as the epitome of success and high society. They left me standing in the shadows, holding a catering apron. They expected me to cry. They expected me to run to the bathroom in tears, crushed by the weight of their relentless bullying. They thought they had successfully put the poor, uneducated freelancer back in her place. But I did not cry. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body. I looked at the black apron in my hands, and then I looked around the magnificent ballroom. I slowly folded the apron over my arm and allowed a genuine razor-sharp smile to spread across my face. Because there was a massive reality that my husband and his toxic family knew absolutely nothing about. They thought I was a struggling consultant, barely scraping by on small spreadsheets. They thought my modest clothes and quiet demeanor were signs of weakness and poverty. They had no idea who I really was. I was not just a consultant, I was a ruthless venture capitalist and a commercial real estate mogul. For the past decade, I had been building a massive financial empire hidden entirely behind blind trusts and anonymous limited liability companies. I preferred the shadows. I did not need validation from society photographers or sorority galas. I cared about equity acquisitions and raw, unfiltered power. I thought about the grueling years I spent building my company from the ground up. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers, dismantled corporate monopolies, and secured properties across the entire eastern seaboard. I was the silent partner behind 3 of the largest tech hubs in Atlanta. I had fought tooth and nail in boardrooms full of older men who tried to intimidate me, and I had destroyed them all. The idea that this superficial family thought they could break me with a catering apron was genuinely hilarious. They were playing a child game of dress-up and pretend wealth while I was playing chess with the entire city infrastructure. As I watched Vivian laugh with her wealthy friends boasting about her elite status, I felt a deep surge of dark amusement. She had no idea that the $15 million luxury hotel we were currently standing in was owned by my commercial real estate firm. Every chandelier, every marble floor, every chair at that VIP table technically belonged to me. More importantly, Vivian had spent the last 3 months bragging to anyone who would listen about the anonymous platinum sponsor who had funded this entire gala. She had used that massive donation to elevate her own prestige as the event organizer, claiming she had exclusive connections to mysterious billionaires. She did not know that the anonymous platinum sponsor was the very same woman she had just handed a catering apron to. I walked to the back of the room and found a quiet, dimly lit booth near the exit. I sat down, smoothing my unbranded dress, and watched them perform for the cameras. Dion was posing perfectly, flashing his charming smile, playing the role of the successful son. He had no idea that the money he used to buy his tailored tuxedo came from an account I secretly funded to keep him from drowning in debt. Dominique and Terrence were taking selfies, pretending to be Atlanta, next big power couple. I knew for a fact that Dominique Cosmetics' line had not turned a profit in 3 years. I knew Terrence leased his luxury cars and was heavily underwater on his fake crypto investments. They were all living a spectacular lie funded by credit cards, desperation, and a sickening need to feel superior to others. For years I had stayed quiet out of love for Dayon. I had endured the snide remarks at family dinners. I had bitten my tongue when Winston, my father-in-law, used his background as a retired judge to talk down to me like I was a criminal in his courtroom. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace, believing that eventually my husband would wake up and defend me. But tonight, watching Dion shrink away and tell me to go put on an apron, the last remaining thread of my affection snapped. The illusion of my marriage dissolved right there in the ballroom. I was married to a fraud and I was tied to a family of predators. They viewed my kindness as weakness. They viewed my silence as stupidity. They had pushed the family scapegoat as far as she could go. I pulled my phone from my clutch and opened my secure email application. I typed a quick message to my lead corporate attorney. The message was simple. The grace period is over. It is time to initiate a complete audit of all shared assets and begin drafting the separation protocols. I hit send and watched the confirmation flash on the screen. I leaned back in the shadows sipping a glass of sparkling water and watched my in-laws celebrate their imagined superiority. They thought they owned this city. They thought they owned me. But they were dancing in a building I owned, drinking wine I paid for, and sleeping in beds I was about to repossess. I decided right then that I would not just leave Dion. A simple divorce would be too easy. It would allow them to spin the narrative and paint me as the villain. No, I was going to let them keep digging their own graves. I was going to wait for the perfect moment to pull the financial rug out from under their feet. I was going to let them discover in the most painful way possible exactly who they had been messing with. The gala music swelled, the cameras flashed, and Vivian raised her glass for a toast. I raised my glass of water from the back of the room in silent agreement. Enjoy the champagne, Vivian, I thought to myself, letting my smile widen. Enjoy the spotlight, because the countdown has officially begun, and when the music stops, I am taking everything. The morning sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my master bedroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported hardwood floor. Dion was still tangled in the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets, snoring softly, sleeping off the expensive bourbon he had consumed at the gala. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Yesterday, that sight might have filled me with a quiet, enduring affection. Today, it filled me with nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I turned away, walking barefoot down the silent hallway to my private home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and sat at my desk, waking up my encrypted workstation. Every month, I deposited exactly $12,000 into our joint checking account. It was my decoy account, calibrated to perfectly match the income of a moderately successful freelance financial consultant. It was enough to cover the mortgage on our $2 million home, the utilities, and Dion leasing fees for his luxury sedan. I kept my actual wealth, the millions generated by my venture capital firm and real estate holdings, locked behind layers of corporate shielding. Dion thought the joint account was the entirety of my financial existence. I opened the banking portal to pay the monthly landscaping invoice. The screen loaded, displaying the summary dashboard. I froze. The balance, which should have sat comfortably at $52,000, was hovering at exactly $7,000. My eyes darted to the recent transactions ledger. There it was, processed late Thursday afternoon. An outgoing wire transfer for $45,000. The recipient account belonged to an entity called Apex Genesis Holdings. I knew that name immediately. It was the shell company Terrence used to launder his failing cryptocurrency ventures. My pulse remained steady. I did not panic. When you manage billions of dollars in commercial assets, you do not let a missing $45,000 trigger an emotional breakdown. You follow the money, and you find the rat. I minimized the banking window and opened the secure application for my home surveillance system. Dion thought we relied on a standard consumer-grade video doorbell to protect our property. He had no idea that my corporate security team had hardwired military-grade high-definition cameras with audio capturing capabilities into the crown molding of every common room in the house. I accessed the kitchen camera archive and filtered the timeline for Thursday afternoon. The video feed popped onto my monitor, crystal clear and damning. Dion was standing by the marble kitchen island, pouring a glass of sparkling water. Terrence paced back and forth across the kitchen tiles, running his hands over his freshly lined-up haircut, looking frantic. The hidden microphone picked up their conversation with perfect clarity. "Man, you have to help me out here, Dion," Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. "The lenders are breathing down my neck. They are threatening to seize the cars. If Dominique finds out the business is underwater, she will leave me. You know how your sister is about her image." Dayon leaned against the counter, looking annoyed but ultimately weak. "I cannot just pull cash out of thin air, Terrence. My mother is already asking questions about why we have not upgraded the house yet. Zuri manages the budget and she tracks every dime that goes into that joint account. Tell her it was a tax penalty. Tell her the market dipped. Terrence pressed, stepping closer to my husband. Come on, man. Black families stick together. We elevate each other. Zuri does not understand how our world works. She just plays with little spreadsheets all day. She is a submissive girl, Dayon. She will believe whatever you tell her. You are the man of the house. Act like it. I watched the screen, my fingernails biting into my palms. I waited for my husband to defend my intelligence, to defend our marriage, to throw Terrence out of our home. Instead, Dion let out a heavy sigh, set down his glass, and walked out of the camera frame. A minute later, he returned. He was holding my secondary banking iPad and the encrypted security fob required to authorize large wire transfers. Just take it and do the transfer yourself, Dion said, handing the devices directly to Terrence. Do not take more than 45. I will intercept the bank alert on her phone and delete the email confirmation before she sees it. I will tell her we had to cover an emergency plumbing repair for my parents. She will not push back. She is too scared of my mother to ask questions. Terrence snatched the fob with a greedy, relieved grin. You are a lifesaver, brother. I will pay you back when the next crypto bull run hits, I swear. I paused the video. The image of my husband handing over the keys to my livelihood froze on the screen. The sheer cowardice of it all washed over me. He was perfectly willing to steal my hard-earned money to fund a degenerate scammer simply because he lacked the spine to say no to his family. Seeing Terrence clutch that security fob triggered a visceral, sickening memory. The sting of betrayal transported me back 3 years, right back to the morning of my wedding day. I was sitting in the bridal suite of the country club wearing a simple silk robe, having my makeup done. The room was supposed to be filled with joy and anticipation. Instead, the door swung open and Vivian marched in. She dismissed the makeup artist with a sharp flick of her wrist and locked the door behind her. She did not offer me a smile. She did not tell me I looked beautiful. She marched directly to my vanity and slammed a thick stack of catering and vendor invoices down on the glass surface. We have a serious problem, Zuri, Vivian had announced, her tone dripping with manufactured distress. The family is entirely strapped for cash right now. Winston Investments have been tied up in a liquidity crisis, and we simply cannot cover the final payments for the reception. I had looked at the invoices. They totaled nearly $80,000. But Vivian, I had stammered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Dayon told me you and Winston insisted on paying for the venue and the food because you wanted to invite 200 of your sorority and fraternity guests. I do not have this kind of liquid cash just sitting around. Vivian had crossed her arms, looking down her nose at me with absolute disdain. Listen to me very carefully, little girl. A woman marrying into this family must pull her weight. We are offering you our prestigious name. We are elevating you from obscurity. The least you can do is figure out how to finance your own wedding. Take out a loan. Liquidate whatever meager savings you have. Black excellence requires sacrifice, Zuri. Do not embarrass us today. I had been so desperate to please her, so desperate to be accepted into their fold. I had quietly logged into my brokerage account and liquidated a chunk of my blue-chip stock portfolio, paying the vendors directly just hours before walking down the aisle. I smiled through the entire ceremony, keeping the secret to protect Dion's pride. But the true gut punch came during the reception. I was sitting at the head table, exhausted and financially drained, when Winston tapped his champagne glass to command the room attention. He took the microphone and invited Terrence to the center of the dance floor. With tears of pride in her eyes, Vivian handed Terrence an oversized, presentation-style novelty check written out for exactly $100,000. To our brilliant son-in-law, Terrence, Winston had boomed over the speakers, the crowd erupting into applause. To fund your revolutionary crypto wealth management platform. We believe in investing in our own blood. We believe in building generational wealth. I had sat there feeling physically ill. The family was not strapped for cash. They simply refused to spend a single dime on me. They had financially drained me to pay for their extravagant party just so they could hand a massive fortune to a man who produced absolutely nothing of value. They had played me for an absolute fool. I snapped back to the present, blinking away the memory of the wedding reception. The anger burning in my chest was no longer hot and chaotic. It was refined, focused, and deadly. Dion and Terrence thought they had successfully stolen $45,000, but my instincts as a venture capitalist were screaming at me. A desperate man like Terrence, a man who owed money to dangerous lenders, does not stop at 45,000. If he had access to my iPad, my security fob, and my personal information, he would have dug deeper. I opened a new tab on my browser and bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus. Using my executive credentials, I logged directly into the institutional risk assessment database that my firm utilized to vet commercial borrowers. I entered my social security number, my full legal name, and initiated a deep dive, comprehensive soft pull on my entire financial identity. The system lagged for a few seconds, aggregating data from regional banks, private lenders, and federal records. The progress bar inched across the screen. I held my breath, listening to the faint sound of Dion footsteps walking to the master bathroom down the hall. The database refreshed. The screen populated with my active credit lines. My mortgage was there, pristine and up to date. My corporate cards were listed paid in full. But right below them, flagged with a bright red warning indicator, was a newly established liability. I clicked on the trade line, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted details. It was a commercial hard money loan originated just 4 days ago. The principal amount was staggering, $350,000. The interest rate was a predatory astronomical 22%, structured with a balloon payment due in exactly 6 months. I dug into the origination documents. The primary borrower was listed as Apex Genesis Holdings Terrence Fake Crypto Company. But Terrence had no credit, no assets, and no verifiable income. No institutional lender would ever underwrite that kind of risk for him. I scrolled down to the guarantor section, and the blood completely drained from my face. Terrence had not just stolen cash from my checking account. While he held my security fob and my iPad, he had accessed my digital signature files. He had used my pristine 800-plus credit score and my social security number to legally bind me as the primary guarantor for the $350,000 loan. He had forged my authorization to co-sign the debt. If Terrence defaulted on this predatory loan, and I knew for an absolute fact that he would, the shadow creditors would not go after his leased Lamborghinis. They would come directly for me. They would attach liens to my properties, freeze my visible assets, and drag my name into a catastrophic default. Terrence had not just picked my pocket. He had chained me to a sinking illegal ship, and my husband had handed him the ropes. I closed the laptop, the screen going black. They truly believed I was nothing but a quiet, naive girl who balanced grocery budgets. They thought I was defenseless. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who dismantled entire corporations for sport. The $45,000 was an insult, but the forged loan was a fatal error. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. I did not confront Dion when he finally walked out of the master bathroom. I sat at the kitchen island sipping black coffee, watching him adjust his designer silk tie. He kissed my forehead, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was currently staring at a dead man walking. He mumbled an excuse about an early morning meeting with a potential client, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I stood up, went to my closet, and dressed for war. I chose a simple, unbranded beige trench coat and a pair of flat loafers. I needed to look exactly like the naive, manageable wife they all thought I was. I drove straight to the primary branch of First Atlanta Heritage Bank, the institution where Dion and I held our joint checking account. This branch was located in the heart of Buckhead, an area dripping with old Southern money and elitist gatekeepers. I bypassed the tellers and walked directly toward the glass-paneled offices at the back. I knocked once on the door, bearing the brass nameplate of Arthur Sterling, the branch manager. Arthur was a classic Atlanta fixture. He was in his late 60s, wore an expensive but outdated suit, and had a wall covered in photographs of himself playing golf at the country club. One of those photographs prominently featured my father-in-law Winston gripping a putter and laughing alongside Arthur. Arthur looked up from his desk and flashed a patronizing, overly familiar smile. He stood gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "Zuri, it is always a pleasure to see Dayon, lovely wife," Arthur said, his tone thick with fake southern charm. "I suppose you are here about the joint account. Dion called me earlier this week and mentioned you might be a little confused by some recent restructuring." I kept my posture rigid and my voice perfectly level. "I am not confused, Arthur. There was an unauthorized wire transfer of $45,000 executed from that account yesterday afternoon. I am here to formally contest that transaction, freeze the account immediately, and place a hard lock on all credit inquiries linked to my Social Security number." Arthur chuckled. It was a deep rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a slow child. "Now, Zuri, let us not overreact and start freezing accounts," he said smoothly. "Judge Winston actually called me personally to vouch for that transaction. He explained that the family is navigating some complex investment opportunities right now. You know how Judge Winston operates. He protects the family name above all else. Sometimes these high-level business deals are complicated. It is best to just let the men handle the business, Zuri. Dayon knows exactly what he is doing. You do not need to stress yourself over the heavy lifting. Black families stick together by respecting the hierarchy, and Winston has always steered his ship with a steady hand." He reached across the desk, intending to pat my hand. I pulled my hand back sharply. The sheer arrogance of this mediocre branch manager thinking he could gaslight me into accepting financial fraud was staggering. He was relying on the exact same toxic patriarchal playbook that Winston used to control his own household. They genuinely believed that dropping Winston's former judicial title would force me to submit. The time for playing the meek, submissive daughter-in-law was officially over. I dropped the facade entirely. I sat back in the leather chair, crossed my legs, and stared at Arthur with a gaze so intensely cold that his patronizing smile began to falter. I reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and bypassed my standard contact list. I opened my encrypted business directory and dialed the direct cellular number for Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance was not a branch manager. He was the regional vice president of the entire First Atlanta Heritage banking conglomerate. He sat on the executive board that governed every single transaction this bank processed across the state of Georgia. I put the phone on speaker and set it down on Arthur's polished mahogany desk. The phone rang exactly twice before the line clicked open. Ms. Zuri. Marcus answered immediately, his voice completely stripped of corporate posturing and filled with absolute unwavering deference. "To what do I owe the immense pleasure this morning? Is there an issue with the commercial escrow accounts?" Arthur's face drained of all color. He stared at the phone, his mouth falling open slightly. He recognized the voice of his supreme boss instantly, but he could not comprehend why the regional vice president was addressing me with such terrifying respect. "No issue with the escrow accounts, Marcus," I said, my voice sharp and commanding. "However, I am currently sitting in the Buckhead office of your branch manager, Arthur Sterling. Arthur just refused to freeze a compromised account holding my personal funds. He informed me that I should let the men handle the business because my father-in-law vouched for a fraudulent transaction." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the speakerphone. When Marcus finally spoke, the warmth was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless corporate fury. "Arthur, are you absolutely out of your mind?" Marcus demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the small glass office. "Sir, I thought, since Judge Winston—" Arthur stammered, sweating profusely, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. "I do not care about a retired local judge," Marcus barked. "Do you have any idea who is sitting across from you? That woman is the managing partner of Vanguard Horizon Capital. Her firm holds a 20% controlling stake in our entire commercial lending division. She practically owns the building you are sitting in, Arthur. If she asks you to freeze an account, you freeze the account. If she asks you to empty the vault, you hand her a bag. Do exactly what she says right now, or you will be clearing out your desk by noon." I reached forward and ended the call, cutting Marcus off. I looked at Arthur. He was visibly trembling, his golf course tan replaced by a sickly chalky white. The patronizing Southern gentleman had vanished. He was looking at me like I was a predator that had just unhinged its jaw. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Arthur," I said, leaning over his desk. You are going to freeze the joint account. You are going to flag the $45,000 transfer as fraudulent. And then you are going to pull a complete unfiltered 10-year forensic audit trail of every single transaction ever executed under my Social Security number, my maiden name and my married name. I want every deposit, every withdrawal, and every single routed transfer printed out and handed to me in the next 10 minutes. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. Right away, ma'am. He frantically hammered away at his keyboard, bypassing every standard protocol to access the deepest levels of the banking mainframe. I sat in absolute silence, watching him sweat through his tailored shirt. 10 minutes later, he handed me a massive, freshly printed stack of ledger documents. I took the papers without thanking him and walked out of the bank, leaving Arthur staring at his desk in silent terror. I drove to a private, secure workspace located in one of my commercial buildings downtown. I locked the door, spread the hundreds of pages across a massive oak conference table, and went to work. I had spent a decade evaluating the financial health of multinational corporations. Auditing my own husband was effortless. The numbers told a story of absolute stomach-turning parasitism. Dion had not just stolen $45,000 for a one-time emergency. He had been systematically bleeding my income dry for the entire duration of our marriage. I tracked the routing numbers on dozens of recurring withdrawals that he had previously claimed were going into a high-yield savings account for our future children. The savings account did not exist. Instead, I found a digital paper trail of $15,000 wire transfers routed directly to a corporate shell entity named Diamond by Dom. It was Dominique Failing Cosmetics brand. Dominique loved to boast on social media about being a self-made independent girl boss. She posted daily about her luxury packaging and her exclusive manufacturer in Italy. The audit proved that her entire brand was a catastrophic failure, surviving solely because my husband was funneling my hard-earned cash into her negative balance sheets. I was literally funding the Golden Child vanity project. I moved to the next set of documents and uncovered something even worse. Every single month for the last 4 years, Dion had executed a $3,000 transfer labeled as secondary property insurance. I traced the routing code. It did not go to an insurance broker. It went directly to a high-end exotic car leasing dealership in Buckhead. Terrence did not own his flashy Lamborghinis. He did not even pay his own leases. My husband was paying Terrence monthly car notes using my freelance income all so Terrence could maintain the illusion of being a hyper-successful crypto millionaire. Dion was actively financing the exact same arrogant lifestyle that his family used to mock me. They looked down on my modest wardrobe and quiet lifestyle while literally wearing clothes and driving cars paid for with my money. The level of coordination required to hide this from me meant that Dion had spent years forging bank statements, intercepting physical mail, and lying straight to my face every single night we sat down for dinner. He was not a victim of his mother manipulation. He was a willing, active participant in my financial exploitation. I was furious, but I kept digging. I knew how to read the negative space in a financial audit. I knew that if they were comfortable stealing thousands, they were absolutely planning something much larger to cover Terrence's massive new debt. I reached the final pages of the audit trail, which contained the automated credit inquiry logs generated over the last 30 days. My eyes locked onto a hard credit pull executed just 48 hours ago by a premier title and escrow company located in downtown Atlanta. You do not use a title company to secure a personal loan. You use a title company when you are leveraging real estate. I cross-referenced the property identification number attached to the inquiry. The breath hitched in my throat. It was the parcel number for my home. Before I ever met Dion, I had purchased a sprawling, beautiful estate in cash. It was a $2 million property, completely debt-free, hidden under a blind trust to protect my privacy. When we got married, Dion insisted we live there, claiming he wanted to build his life in the house I loved. I had never put his name on the deed. It was solely my asset. But the inquiry proved they were not just trying to cover Terrence's immediate tracks. They had somehow bypassed the blind trust protections. They were actively processing the preliminary paperwork for a massive home equity line of credit. They were attempting to extract the full $2 million of equity out of my house to save Terrence from his underworld creditors and fund the family lifestyle for the next decade. I stared at the paperwork, the terrifying reality of their plot crystallizing in my mind. They did not just want to drain my bank accounts. They were plotting to steal the very roof over my head, cash out my largest personal asset, and leave me holding the bag for millions in fraudulent debt. They were trying to annihilate my entire existence. I did not confront Dion when he came home that evening. I did not scream, and I did not throw his expensive clothes onto the manicured front lawn. Instead, I carefully packed the printed bank records and the terrifying title inquiry into a secure briefcase, locked it inside my hidden floor safe, and prepared my mask for the evening. It was Friday, which meant we were expected at Winston's sprawling estate in the most exclusive enclave of Buckhead to celebrate his 62nd birthday. I knew I had to walk into the lion den and smile at the very people who were actively plotting my total financial ruin. Winston Estate was a monument to his towering ego. It was a massive, ostentatious brick mansion with towering white columns, a circular driveway lined with imported luxury vehicles, and a grand foyer that looked like a museum dedicated entirely to himself. As Dion and I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, the atmosphere was immediately suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered lamb, heavy floral perfumes, and the toxic unspoken microaggressions that defined every single gathering with my in-laws. Winston stood in the center of the foyer holding a glass of aged scotch. He wore a velvet smoking jacket and carried himself with the pompous authority of a man who still believed he was sitting on a judicial bench. Vivian was right beside him, draped in a glittering emerald gown, her wrists heavy with tennis bracelets. She greeted Dion with a warm, theatrical embrace, kissing both of his cheeks and praising how handsome her son looked. When she turned to me, her smile instantly vanished, replaced by a tight, forced line of tolerance. She offered me a stiff nod and gestured toward the formal dining room, completely ignoring the expensive bottle of wine I had brought as a gift. The dining table was set with crystal goblets, silver cutlery, and elaborate floral centerpieces that made it nearly impossible to see the person sitting across from you. I took my usual seat near the end of the table, flanked by Dion on one side and Dominique on the other. Dominique was wearing an overly flashy sequined dress that looked entirely inappropriate for a family dinner. Terrence sat across from her, loudly bragging to Winston about a supposed cryptocurrency algorithm he had just mastered. Listening to him speak about digital assets while knowing he was drowning in $2 million of illicit debt took every ounce of self-control I possessed. As the catered dinners was served, the psychological warfare began. Vivian loved to use the dining table as a stage to assert her dominance, and I was always her favorite target. She took a delicate bite of her salad and looked at me down the length of the long table. "Zuri, I noticed you wore that same beige dress to the church service last month," Vivian said loudly, ensuring all conversation around the table stopped. "It is so resourceful of you to stretch a limited wardrobe. I suppose not everyone has the capital to invest in their personal presentation." Dion chuckled nervously, cutting into his steak without offering a single word of defense for his wife. I placed my fork down and offered Vivian a serene, deferential smile. "You are right, Vivian," I said softly. "I prefer to keep things simple. I do not have your incredible eye for fashion." Vivian practically preened at the compliment, her shoulders relaxing as she absorbed the validation. That was the secret to surviving narcissists. If you completely submit to their distorted worldview, they instantly drop their armor. But Dominique could not let the moment pass without twisting the knife further. She leaned over, flipping her hair over her shoulder, and looked at me with exaggerated pity. "It is okay that you just do little spreadsheets, Zuri." Dominique chimed in, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We cannot all be founders like me. Building a luxury brand takes a specific type of visionary ambition. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure of being a CEO. You are better suited for quiet background work." I looked at Dominique, fighting back a wave of dark, genuine amusement. She was lecturing me about ambition while actively funding her dead-end cosmetics brand with money stolen directly from my corporate checking account. She was a complete fraud, sitting at a table paid for by her father hidden gambling debts, married to a man facing imminent destruction by loan sharks. They were a house of cards pretending to be a fortress. I lowered my eyes, playing the role of the meek, uninspired wife to absolute perfection. I admire your drive so much, Dominique. I replied, making sure my voice sounded appropriately small and intimidated. Your brand is so visible. I am just happy to stay in the background and support Dion however I can. That is my priority. The entire table practically hummed with sickening satisfaction. Winston nodded approvingly, raising his glass to my statement. Vivian smiled, clearly delighted that the family scapegoat knew her proper place. By feeding their massive egos, I became completely invisible to them. I was no longer a threat. I was just the submissive, dull woman they could easily manipulate into signing away her home. They felt so incredibly smart, so entirely superior that they failed to notice the predator sitting right in their midst. As the dessert plates were cleared away, Winston stood up and clapped his hands together. "All right, gentlemen," Winston announced, his voice booming across the dining room. "Let us leave the ladies to their gossip. It is time for a real drink. Dion, Terrence, join me in the study. We have some important family investments to review." Dion kissed my cheek and immediately followed his father down the hall. Terrence practically sprinted after them, desperate to maintain the illusion that he was a critical part of their financial brain trust. I knew exactly what that meeting was about. They were going to finalize the timeline for presenting me with the fraudulent home equity documents. They were gathering in that room to put the finishing touches on my execution. Vivian and Dominique immediately moved to the formal living room, pouring themselves more wine and launching into a vicious critique of a fellow sorority sister. I waited exactly 3 minutes before standing up. "Excuse me, Vivian," I said politely. "I am just going to step into the powder room to freshen up. Take your time, Zuri." Vivian replied without even looking at me. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, moving past the guest bathroom entirely. The sprawling estate was a maze, but I knew the layout perfectly. Winston's cigar study was located at the far east wing of the house, accessible through a set of heavy double doors in the main corridor. However, it also had a secondary entrance that connected to the outdoor patio, a door Winston rarely locked. I slipped through the side hallway and stepped out into the humid Georgia night. Moving silently along the brick pathway, I approached the glass patio door that led into the study. I peered through the sheer curtains. The room was empty. Winston, Dion, and Terrence were standing out on the opposite balcony, lighting their imported cigars and waiting for the bartender to bring up a fresh bottle of scotch. I had a window of exactly 60 seconds. I silently turned the brass handle and slipped inside the study. The room smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and expensive polish. The walls were lined with law books Winston had never actually read. In the center of the room sat his massive, imposing mahogany desk. This was the throne from which he dictated his fraudulent commands. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out the device. It was a matte black, high-tech voice-activated recording transmitter. It was completely undetectable to electronic sweeps, equipped with a military-grade microphone capable of picking up a whisper from 20 feet away and paired directly to an encrypted cloud server on my phone. I dropped to my knees and slid under the heavy mahogany desk. I felt along the underside of the thick wood, bypassing the center drawer until I found a recessed groove near the back panel. I pressed the magnetic backing of the transmitter against the wood. It attached with a soft, solid click. I ran my fingers over it to ensure it was completely flush and hidden from any conceivable angle. I crawled out from under the desk, brushed off my knees, and checked my surroundings. The study remained perfectly still. Outside on the balcony, I could hear Terrence laughing loudly at a joke Winston had just made. I slipped back out through the patio door, pulling it shut silently behind me. I navigated my way back through the estate, moving with the calm, measured steps of a woman who had just planted a live grenade in the heart of her enemy camp. I stopped in the guest bathroom just long enough to wash my hands and check my expression in the mirror. My face was a mask of placid, unbothered innocence. When I returned to the formal living room, Vivian and Dominique were still laughing and drinking their wine. "Everything all right, Zuri?" Dominique asked, her tone laced with fake concern. You were gone for quite a while. Everything is perfect, I replied softly, taking my seat on the edge of the sofa. I just needed a quiet moment. I picked up my crystal wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked at Vivian draped in her stolen jewels and Dominique boasting about her fraudulent empire. In a few moments, the men would return from the study completely unaware that every single word of their treacherous plot was actively uploading to my private servers. They thought they were building a trap for a naive little bird. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire existence directly to a titan. I smiled at my mother-in-law, letting the rich red wine coat my throat. I sat there in the heart of their toxic kingdom, watching them laugh, entirely secure in the knowledge that the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The next morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky that perfectly matched the impending execution of my marriage. Dion woke up early, kissed my cheek with his usual practiced affection, and grabbed his gym bag. He told me he was meeting Terrence for a morning squash game to burn off the heavy dinner from the night before. I watched his car back out of the driveway, maintaining a calm, sleepy smile until his taillights disappeared around the corner. The moment the house was empty, I moved. I made a fresh pot of black coffee, carried my mug down the hallway, and locked myself inside my private office. My heart beat with a steady rhythmic thud. I sat at my desk and woke up my encrypted workstation. I opened the secure cloud server linked to the transmitter I had planted under Winston Mahogany desk. The file had finished uploading at 3 in the morning. It was a dense, massive audio file spanning nearly 2 hours of pristine, uninterrupted recording. I plugged in my noise-canceling headphones, settled into my leather chair, and pressed play. At first, there was only the ambient noise of the study. The clinking of heavy crystal glasses, the splash of expensive scotch being poured, the distinctive snap of Winston custom gold lighter. Then the heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the men inside. The transition was instantaneous. The arrogant, boastful men who had been laughing in the dining room vanished completely. Terrence was the first to speak, and his voice was completely unrecognizable. He was not the smooth-talking crypto-millionaire who had snapped his fingers at me for a bourbon. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Within seconds, Terrence was openly sobbing. The sound was pathetic, a wet, desperate weeping of a man who knew he was staring at the end of his life. "You do not understand, Winston," Terrence cried, his voice pitching high with absolute terror. "These are not bankers. These are not institutional guys who send letters and file lawsuits. They are shadow lenders. I owe them $2 million and the balloon payment was due yesterday. They told me if I do not wire the funds by Monday, they are going to start taking pieces of me. They know where Dominique sleeps. They know her routine. You have to save me. I will do anything, I swear to God." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the audio track. I could hear the rapid pacing of feet on the hardwood floor. Suddenly, the door clicked open again. Vivian must have slipped away from the living room to join their secret council, likely sensing the gravity of the situation. Vivian's voice pierced the audio, shrill and vibrating with absolute panic. $2 million, Terrence, you absolute fool!" Vivian shrieked, completely abandoning her refined Southern belle persona. "How could you let this happen? Do you have any idea what this means for our family? If word gets out that my son-in-law is involved with criminal loan sharks, we are ruined. The country club board will excommunicate us. My sorority sisters will laugh me out of Atlanta. Our pristine society image will be dragged through the mud. We cannot be associated with this kind of ghetto street-level scandal." I listened as Winston slammed his glass down on his desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "Silence, both of you!" Winston roared, his judicial authority roaring to the surface. "Panic serves absolutely no purpose here. We protect the family name above all else. We handle this quietly and ruthlessly. Terrence, your leased cars are useless, and Dominique Cosmetic business is entirely insolvent. We need liquid cash, and we need it immediately. We have exactly one asset capable of absorbing a $2 million hit without triggering a federal audit." I leaned closer to my monitor, the coffee growing cold in my mug. I knew exactly what asset Winston was talking about. Winston continued, his tone cold and calculating. "Zuri Estate. The house is completely unencumbered. It holds $2 million in verified clean equity. We extract the capital from her property, satisfy these degenerate lenders, and sever Terrence's ties to the underworld. Vivian gasped. But Winston, that house is in her name alone. She keeps that asset locked behind a blind trust. How on earth are we supposed to access the equity without her knowing Zuri handles the household budget? She will see the withdrawal. Winston let out a dark, condescending chuckle. My dear Vivian, you give that girl far too much credit. She is a low-level consultant who clips coupons and wears unbranded dresses. She does not possess the financial literacy to understand complex leverage. We will execute a home equity line of credit. The title company is already preparing the documents based on the soft pull Terrence initiated. All we need is her physical signature on the guarantor line to bypass the trust protections. I held my breath waiting for my husband to speak. This was the moment. This was the exact crossroad where a man either defends his wife or joins the pack of wolves hunting her. Dan had been sitting in that room, listening to his father plot the theft of my home, listening to Terrence beg for a bailout. Dion's voice finally came through the speakers. It was not the nervous, anxious voice he used when making excuses. It was terrifyingly calm. It was a voice stripped of all warmth, vibrating with a chilling, calculated malice. It will not be a problem, Father, Dion said smoothly. She is incredibly naive and deeply in love with me. She trusts me implicitly. My chest tightened as if I had been physically struck. The man I had shared a bed with for years, the man who had vowed to protect me, was speaking about me like I was a sacrificial lamb. I will tell her the bank requires a routine signature for a joint tax filing compliance document. Dion continued, his tone utterly devoid of human emotion. I will bury the signature page deep inside a stack of boring corporate tax amendments. She never questions my legal paperwork. She will sign exactly where I tell her to sign. Once the ink is dry, we pull the $2 million clear Terrence debt and secure the family's standing. What about the loan repayment? Vivian asked, her voice tight with anxiety. A $2 million HELOC carries massive monthly interest. How do we explain the missing funds when she reviews her banking app? We do not have to explain anything. Dion replied, his laugh sending a shiver of absolute ice down my spine. The timeline works perfectly in our favor. Once we secure the cash and the lenders are paid off, I will initiate a quiet separation. I will file for divorce in 6 months, citing irreconcilable differences. By the time the bank comes calling for the balloon payment, I will be legally distanced from her assets. The debt is tied entirely to her signature and her property. Winston grunted his approval. It is a necessary casualty. She never truly belonged in our circle anyway. She brought no pedigree and no real value to this family. Exactly. Dion agreed. She has got no real family to back her up anyway. Her parents are gone and she has no siblings to lean on. She is completely isolated. When the bank forecloses on the estate to satisfy the default, she will not have the capital to fight a protracted legal battle. She will leave with absolutely nothing, and our name stays completely clean. We cut the dead weight, save Terrence, and move on. I sat in my silent office, the audio continuing to play, as they poured another round of celebratory drinks, toasting to their brilliant master plan. They were clinking glasses over my financial grave. They were cheering for my destruction. I reached up and slowly pulled the noise-canceling headphones off my ears. The silence of my empty house rushed in to greet me. Any lingering, pathetic shred of love I had held onto for Dayon evaporated in that exact second. It did not fade. It did not die a slow death. It was incinerated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute void. He was not a coward manipulated by his family. He was the architect of my demise. He had planned to steal my home, bankrupt my future, and discard me onto the street while preserving his own pristine image. He believed my isolation made me an easy target. He believed I had no power. I set the headphones down on the desk. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a biological response reserved for the living, and the woman who had loved Dion was officially dead. In her place sat a venture capitalist who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate dismantling. They had plotted to steal $2 million from me. They thought that was the ceiling of my wealth. They had absolutely no idea that I could buy their entire lives with the interest generated from a single holding account. I opened my laptop, pulling up a fresh encrypted document. I titled it Vanguard Protocol. I began typing with rapid, precise keystrokes. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin, I was going to show them how an apex predator operates. I was going to let Dion present his fake tax document. I was going to let Terrence believe he was saved. I was going to let Winston and Vivian continue posing as Atlanta royalty. I drafted the timeline for my war strategy. I needed to reroute my hidden assets, weaponize the predatory lenders against Terrence, and legally trap Dion in his own fraudulent web. I was not just going to divorce him. I was going to orchestrate a public catastrophic demolition of the entire family legacy. They were going to lose their money, their homes, their freedom, and the precious society image they valued above human life. I looked at the blinking cursor on the screen. The trap was set. Now I just had to invite them inside. Sunday evening arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the windows of our estate. I had spent the entire weekend playing the role of the blissful, ignorant homemaker. I prepared a lavish dinner spread, roasting a prime rib and setting the dining room table with my finest china. Dion hovered around the kitchen all afternoon, pouring himself glasses of Cabernet and kissing the back of my neck while I cooked. His performance was flawless. If I had not heard his voice on that recording coldly detailing his plan to ruin me and discard me, I might have believed his affection was genuine. Instead, his touch made my skin crawl. I smiled, kept my voice light, and played my part. The doorbell rang precisely at 6. Vivian and Winston swept into the foyer, bringing with them their usual cloud of heavy perfume and unwarranted arrogance. Dominique and Terrence trailed right behind them. Terrence looked completely unraveled. The bags under his eyes were dark and heavy, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly agonizing over the $2 million deadline looming over his head the next morning. Dominique, completely oblivious to her husband's impending doom, immediately began recording a video for her social media followers, showcasing my crystal chandelier as if it were her own. Winston bypassed the guest seating and marched directly to the head of my dining table, claiming the seat of power as he always did. Vivian took the chair to his right, adjusting her designer wrap and casting a disapproving glance at the floral arrangement I had selected. I took my seat quietly, allowing the family to fill the room with their booming voices and fake laughter. Throughout the dinner, the tension was a living, breathing entity in the room. They all thought they were sharing a meal with a clueless sheep moments before the slaughter. Winston held court, regaling us with exaggerated stories from his days on the judicial bench, demanding complete attention. Dion played the supportive son, pouring more wine and nodding eagerly at every punchline. Terrence barely touched his prime rib. He kept shooting desperate, wide-eyed glances at Winston, silently begging the patriarch to initiate the final phase of their scheme. I chewed my food slowly, savoring the absolute absurdity of the situation. Every bite tasted like victory. I watched them perform their little play, knowing that I held the detonator to their entire fake empire. As the plates were cleared and I served the blackberry tart for dessert, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The forced laughter faded. Winston cleared his throat, a deep rumbling sound designed to command total obedience. He reached down into his leather briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He placed it squarely on the table, resting his large hands on top of it. "Zuri, my dear." Winston began flashing his signature judiciary smile, the one he used when he wanted to project warmth while delivering a sentence. Dion and I have been spending some time restructuring the family tax liabilities. With the market shifting the way it is, we need to protect our wealth and optimize our holdings. He slid the thick folder across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my dessert plate. "I need your signature on these routine exemption forms," Winston said, his tone dripping with paternal condescension. "It is just a minor adjustment to how we file the marital assets this quarter. Do not worry your pretty head over the legal jargon. I have reviewed it all personally, and it is perfectly standard. Just sign the highlighted tabs on the back pages so we can get it filed by tomorrow morning." Terrence let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the table. Vivian took a slow sip of her wine, watching me with eager, hungry eyes. Dion placed a warm, reassuring hand over mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It will only take a second, babe," Dion murmured softly, turning his handsome face toward me. "My dad handled all the heavy lifting. Just sign on the sticky notes and we can get back to enjoying our evening." I looked down at the folder. I did not immediately reach for the pen Dion was holding out to me. Instead, I carefully opened the manila cover and flipped past the generic tax summary they had placed on top as a decoy. I turned to the thick stack of institutional paperwork buried beneath it. The heading of the document was printed in bold, undeniable letters. Commercial Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. I scanned the paragraphs, my eyes darting over the familiar legal structures I dismantled every single day at my firm. The principal draw was exactly $2 million. The collateral securing the debt was the deed to my home, and the primary beneficiary account authorized to receive the instant wire transfer was Apex Genesis Holdings. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I simply kept my eyes on the paperwork and allowed my posture to completely change. I sat back in my chair, dropping the hunched, submissive body language they were so used to seeing. I crossed my legs and looked directly at Winston. "Winston," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the dining room with razor-sharp precision. "I am a little confused by the structure of this routine tax exemption." Winston's smile remained frozen, though his eyes darted toward Dion for a fraction of a second. "There is no need to be confused, Zuri. It is just standard corporate shielding. Just sign the back page." I flipped to the third page of the contract, running my manicured finger down the list of financial covenants. "I am looking at Section 4, Paragraph B." I continued, my tone shifting from the naive wife to the ruthless venture capitalist. "Why does a standard tax liability restructuring require a lien against the primary deed of my debt, free real estate? Furthermore, the interest rate listed here is variable, currently sitting at 19% with a balloon payment maturing in exactly 6 months. That is an incredibly predatory amortization schedule for a simple tax adjustment." The dining room plunged into an absolute deathly silence. Terrence's face drained of all color matching the white tablecloth. Vivian lowered her wine glass, her jaw hanging slightly open. Dominique looked utterly bewildered, unable to comprehend the words coming out of my mouth. Winston cleared his throat again, but the booming authority was completely gone. "Zuri, you are misinterpreting the boilerplate language. It is a blanket form. The bank just uses that template for all high-net-worth clients. I assure you, as a former judge, there is absolutely zero risk to your property." I did not break eye contact with him. I flipped to the final page of the contract, staring at the routing information. "That is fascinating, Winston," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Because if I read this disbursement clause correctly, the entire $2 million draw is scheduled to be wired directly to an LLC called Apex Genesis Holdings. That is a shell company registered in Delaware. It has no verifiable revenue, no physical corporate address, and operates entirely in unregulated cryptocurrency markets. Why on earth would we transfer the equity of my home to a severely overleveraged ghost entity?" Winston's mouth snapped shut. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning terror. The naive, quiet girl who played with little spreadsheets was suddenly speaking the exact language of institutional corporate finance. She was actively dissecting a complex financial crime in real time. Vivian slammed her hand on the table. "Zuri, how dare you question Winston?" she shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "He is trying to help you and Dayon build wealth. You are completely out of line. You do not know what you are talking about." I turned my gaze to Vivian, letting the ice in my veins radiate through my eyes. "I know exactly what I am talking about, Vivian," I replied coldly. "I am talking about a fraudulent loan application designed to extract $2 million from my personal asset to pay off Terrence's shadow lenders before they come break his legs tomorrow morning." Terrence let out a choked gasp, knocking his chair backward as he scrambled to his feet. He looked like he was about to vomit directly onto the imported rug. Dominique grabbed his arm, her face twisting in confusion. "Terrence, what is she talking about?" Dominique demanded, her voice rising in panic. What shadowlenders? Shut up, Dominique. Winston barked, completely losing his composure. He glared at me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Zuri, you are crossing a line you cannot uncross. You will sign that document right now, or you will face severe consequences. You do not understand the mechanics of this family. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the marble table. I understand the mechanics perfectly, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. You run a family of parasites. You drain everything you touch to maintain a fake image of power. But you made a fatal miscalculation. You assumed I was weak because I chose to be quiet. You assumed you could steal my home and file for divorce in 6 months without me fighting back. Dayon had been sitting completely paralyzed beside me. At the mention of the divorce, his entire body flinched. The realization hit him like a freight train. I knew everything. I had heard everything. The mask he had worn for our entire marriage shattered into a million pieces. The charming, loving husband evaporated, replaced by the desperate, cornered predator he truly was. He realized that the submissive wife he planned to discard was actually a fortress he could not penetrate. His fake smile vanished. His jaw locked and the veins in his neck bulged with sudden explosive rage. Dion shot out of his chair, towering over me. He slammed his fist down onto the dining table with terrifying force, causing the crystal wine glasses to jump and shatter against the marble. Red wine spilled across the white linen, looking like fresh blood. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes dark and threatening. You are going to pick up that pen, Zuri. Dion growled, his voice a low, vibrating snarl of pure menace. You are going to stop playing these little games, and you are going to sign that document immediately. You are my wife. You will do exactly what I tell you to do, or I promise you, I will make your life an absolute living hell. Sign it now. I sat perfectly still, looking up at the monster I had married. The trap had closed. They were exactly where I wanted them. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away from the man towering over me. Dayon chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths, his handsome face contorted into something ugly and primal. The shattered crystal on the table sparkled amidst the spilled wine, a perfect visual for the sudden, violent destruction of our marriage. For years he had played the role of the refined, educated gentleman. He had worn the tailored suits, flashed the practiced smile, and presented himself to the world as the epitome of grace and success. Now backed into a corner with his family financial crimes exposed and laid bare on his father mahogany dining table, the polish completely peeled away. The mask was gone. In his eyes, I saw the desperate, feral panic of a fraud who had just been caught. The shock in the room suddenly shattered, giving way to absolute, unhinged hysteria. The illusion of their pristine, high society existence evaporated in an instant. Vivian erupted from her chair. Her emerald gown caught the light from the chandelier as she pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. The refined Southern belle persona she had weaponized for decades vanished, replaced by a vicious, snarling cruelty. "You ungrateful little nobody," Vivian screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and bouncing down the grand hallways of the estate. "We brought you into this family. We gave you our elite name. We elevated you from nothing, and this is how you repay us. By disrespecting my husband and abandoning your own brother-in-law when he needs you." She paced frantically behind her chair, her breath coming in short, furious gasps. The diamonds on her wrists clinked together, a sharp metallic sound that punctuated her rage. "You are nothing without Dayon!" Vivian continued to shriek, her face twisting with absolute venom. "You are a freelancer who plays with little spreadsheets in your pajamas. You do not belong in our world. You do not understand how real wealth operates. We tolerated your lack of pedigree because Dion loved you, but you have always been a liability to our brand. You will sign those papers, Zuri. You owe this family everything you have." I looked at Vivian, letting her hysterical venom wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. Her delusion was absolute and genuinely pathetic. She actually believed her last name was a magical currency that could buy my blind submission. She thought the so-called privilege of sitting at her dining table was worth a $2 million ransom. She did not know that I could buy her entire estate in cash tomorrow and bulldoze the property just to improve my commute. She was lecturing a titan about wealth while her own son-in-law was dodging underworld loan sharks. Dominique was practically hyperventilating. She clutched her phone to her chest as if she was about to call the police, though she knew full well the authorities were the absolute last people Terence wanted anywhere near this house. Terence had backed himself against the far wall of the dining room. He looked like a man who was already measuring himself for a coffin. Sweat poured down his face, ruining his expensive collar. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice steady flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Your debts are your own. Your crimes are your own. Enjoy the fallout." Before I could push my chair back to stand, Dion lunged. His hand shot out across the table. His fingers wrapped around my right wrist like a steel vise. He squeezed hard, the pressure instantly bruising my skin and grinding my bones together. His grip was desperate, possessive, and violently aggressive. It was the first time in our entire relationship he had ever laid a hand on me in anger. The physical shock of it was jarring, but it did not instill fear. It only cemented my absolute disgust. "You sign this right now, Zuri," Dayon hissed, leaning over the table and pulling my arm toward him. His eyes were wild, completely devoid of the man I thought I had married. "We do not turn our backs on family. We do not walk away when things get complicated. You are going to fix this. You are going to sign that document, and we are going to walk out of here together. If you walk out that door, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are dead to me, and you will leave with absolutely nothing." I stared down at his hand wrapped tightly around my wrist. I did not cry out in pain. I did not struggle in a blind panic. I processed the physical assault with the exact same cold surgical calculation I used to dismantle failing corporations in the boardroom. He was trying to use physical intimidation because his psychological manipulation had completely failed. He was a weak, pathetic man trying to force a woman to save him from his own cowardice. He thought pain would break my resolve. He was wrong. I locked eyes with Dayon. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet to freezing. "Let go of me," I commanded. My voice dropped an octave, carrying a lethal, uncompromising weight that sent a visible shockwave through his body. "Right now." He hesitated. His grip tightened for a fraction of a second before the absolute terrifying certainty in my eyes made him waver. He blinked, the feral rage in his expression faltering against my complete lack of fear. His fingers loosened just enough. I violently yanked my arm back, pulling my wrist free from his grasp. I stood up slowly, deliberately smoothing the front of my trench coat. I did not break eye contact with him. I wanted him to see the exact moment he lost control of his wife forever. I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder from the table. It contained the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the document that represented their only salvation. The contract that was supposed to save Terence from the Shadow Lenders Fund, Dominique failing cosmetics line, and keep the precious family name out of the mud. Winston took a cautious step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Zuri put the folder down. He said, his voice dropping the booming authority and taking on a desperate, pleading tone. "We can negotiate this. We can find a compromise that protects your assets and helps Terence. We are reasonable people. There is no compromise, Winston," I said, my gaze sweeping across the terrified faces of my in-laws. With agonizing slowness, I gripped the thick stack of legal documents with both hands. I stared directly into Vivian's horrified eyes. Then I twisted my wrists and tore the entire packet of papers directly in half. The sound of the ripping paper was incredibly loud in the silent dining room. It sounded like the tearing of a sail on a sinking ship. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again. I tore through the signature lines, the routing numbers, the false declarations, and the carefully crafted legal lies. I shredded their $2 million lifeline with my bare hands, reducing their master plan to useless confetti. I stepped toward Vivian and let the shredded pieces of their salvation fall directly onto her lap. The shredded paper cascaded over her expensive emerald gown, fluttering to the floor around her designer shoes. She stared down at the ruined documents, her mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. "You are insane!" Dominique finally shrieked, backing away from the table and pressing herself against the wall next to her trembling husband. You have killed us. Winston's face turned a dangerous mottled purple. The veins in his forehead throbbed visibly against his skin. He slammed his heavy fists onto the dining table, leaning over the ruined dinner and the scattered papers. The illusion of the dignified judge was entirely gone. He was nothing but an angry, desperate thug whose scam had just been exposed. I will destroy you! Winston roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier suspended above us. Do you hear me? You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have friends in every bank, every courthouse, and every boardroom in this state. I will make sure you are penniless and blacklisted in Atlanta by sunrise. You will never work in this city again. You will be begging on the streets. I looked at the patriarch of this fraudulent empire. I did not scream back. I did not cry. I did not offer a lengthy monologue about my true wealth, my silent partnerships, or the absolute grip my venture capital firm held over the very banks he claimed to control. Let them believe they held the power. Let them spin their wheels trying to blacklist a woman who owned the lists they thought they manipulated. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness, and I was going to let them choke on it. I turned away from the table, picked up my car keys from the side console, and looked back at them one last time. They stood in the wreckage of their dining room, a family of parasites, realizing the host had just cut them off. We will see about that. I whispered, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. I turned my back on my husband, my toxic in-laws, and the entire grand illusion I had married into. I walked out of the formal dining room, my footsteps echoing down the long marbled hallway. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped out into the night. The humid Georgia air hit my face clean and refreshing. I walked down the circular driveway, got into my car, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the sprawling estate, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood illuminated against the dark sky, a beautiful hollow shell hiding a family of desperate frauds. I drove into the night, leaving them fuming in the wreckage of their own making. The war had officially begun, and I held every single piece of ammunition. The tires of my unassuming mid-range sedan hummed against the dark asphalt of the secluded neighborhood. For years, I had driven this remarkably average vehicle to perfectly maintain the illusion of a modest middle-class consultant. Dion loved that car. He loved how ordinary it made me look next to his leased European sports car. Tonight, however, this quiet sedan felt like a stealth bomber slipping completely under enemy radar. I reached out and tapped the digital display on my dashboard, connecting my encrypted mobile device to the car interface. I completely bypassed the primary contact list Dion regularly monitored and accessed a hidden secondary directory buried deep within a secure partition of the phone. I pressed a single name: Marcus. Marcus was the senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless, predatory corporate litigation firms on the Eastern Seaboard. He was my lead attack dog, a man who routinely dismantled Fortune 500 companies and liquidated rogue executives before he even finished his morning coffee. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. His voice was crisp, alert, and terrifyingly sharp, despite the late hour. Zuri, I was not expecting to hear from you until the quarterly board review, Marcus said, the background noise of his office entirely silent. The timeline has accelerated, Marcus. I replied, my voice hard, flat, and entirely devoid of the meek, submissive tone I had worn like a heavy cloak just an hour ago. I dropped the mask completely. I am dropping the civilian cover. We are executing the burn protocol immediately, full asset lockdown. I need the entire network activated tonight. I could almost hear the predatory smile stretching across his face through the speaker. Understood. Give me the targets. Dion, Winston, Terrence, and every single shell entity attached to their family name. I instructed, merging onto the highway and pushing the accelerator down. I want them financially decapitated by dawn. Seize everything we legally control. The purge began before I even took the next exit. I gave Marcus the absolute authorization to drain the joint checking and savings accounts Dion and I shared. These were decoy accounts holding exactly enough capital to convince my arrogant husband that I was a comfortable yet entirely unremarkable earner. Within 3 minutes, Marcus and his late-night team legally transferred every single cent into a secure blind escrow account, pending imminent divorce litigation. Next were the credit lines. Dion, flashy platinum credit cards, the ones he proudly swiped at expensive steakhouses and luxury car dealerships to impress his friends, were actually secondary cards tied directly to my primary credit profile. I canceled them with a single brutal verbal command. When my husband tried to buy his morning coffee, pay for his squash club membership, or cover the gas to drive to work tomorrow, his cards would instantly decline. He was going to wake up to a zero balance and a frozen life. I did not stop at the liquid cash. I instructed Marcus to completely scrub Dion from my life insurance policies, my health directives, and my emergency contact forms. I severed his access to our shared digital drives and remotely locked him out of the suburban home security system. If he tried to use his thumbprint on the front door later that night, the alarm would trigger, and private security would be dispatched to remove a trespasser. Then I turned my attention to my true empire. My actual wealth, the billions of dollars managed under my venture capital firm, was already fiercely protected behind layers of complex corporate shielding. But Winston was a former judge with deep corrupt ties in the local judicial system. He had just threatened to use his connections to ruin me. I was not going to leave a single microscopic crack in my armor. I ordered my legal team to transfer my primary holding companies into a series of newly formed, impenetrable, offshore, irrevocable trusts. Even if Winston managed to find a corrupt judge willing to sign a subpoena, they would hit a titanium wall of international corporate law that would take a decade to breach. By the time I pulled into the underground parking garage of my private downtown high-rise, Dion was officially a financial ghost. He had absolutely zero access to my money, my assets, or my life. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private biometric elevator directly to the top floor. This penthouse was my actual sanctuary, a sprawling, high-tech command center encased in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering, sprawling Atlanta skyline. Dion did not even know this property existed. I dropped my keys on the granite counter, poured myself a heavy glass of vintage, impossibly expensive red wine, and walked directly into my primary server room. It was time to look incredibly closely at the lions who thought they were hunting me. Winston had threatened to blacklist me. He had bragged about his immense power, his elite connections, and his untouchable status. I needed to know exactly what kind of capital backed up those massive, arrogant threats. I woke up my encrypted terminal, bypassed 3 separate biometric security gates, and unleashed my firm proprietary forensic accounting software directly onto the Winston family tree. I sat back in my leather chair, sipping my wine as the algorithms went to war. The software viciously chewed through public records, hidden tax filings, offshore registry leaks, and encrypted bank routing numbers. The illusion of their high society royalty began to systematically crumble across my monitors in real time. It was a pathetic, incredibly fragile facade. Terrence was not the only one drowning in illicit debt. The entire family was bleeding cash at an apocalyptic rate. The luxury vehicles parked in their circular driveway were all leased under predatory high-interest terms that they were actively defaulting on. Their elite country club memberships were severely in arrears, sustained only by Winston trading shady legal favors with the board of directors. Dominique luxury cosmetic brand had generated zero profit in 3 years and was surviving entirely on fraudulent business loans. But it was the deep dive into Winston personal finances that revealed the most catastrophic, unbelievable truth. The former judge, the man who pompously lectured everyone on fiscal responsibility and elite social status, had a massive, crippling gambling addiction. The software uncovered a vast, desperate trail of wired funds flowing to offshore betting syndicates, illegal bookies, and high-stakes private poker games. He had been hemorrhaging money for over a decade. His losses were staggering, totaling in the tens of millions of dollars. He was not a king. He was a degenerate addict funding a lifestyle he could not afford with credit lines he could not repay. I dug deeper, focusing my search algorithm directly on the crown jewel of their snobbery. I wanted to see the financial structure of the sprawling, ostentatious brick mansion in Buckhead, the grand estate where Vivian hosted her exclusive charity galas, the ancestral home she used to make everyone else feel entirely inferior, the very house I had just walked out of. The financial records displayed on my glowing screen made my jaw physically drop. The mighty estate was a complete and total lie. 5 years ago, completely overwhelmed by his massive gambling debts and facing imminent destruction, Winston had defaulted on his primary mortgage. The property had gone into severe, irreversible foreclosure. To avoid the absolute devastating public humiliation of being evicted in front of their wealthy peers and completely losing their social standing, Winston had begged the bank for a quiet, closed-door corporate auction. The estate had been sold off to an anonymous holding company in a private sale. This faceless corporate entity had purchased the mansion for pennies on the dollar and then executed a sale-leaseback agreement. They graciously agreed to lease the property back to Winston and Vivian at an exorbitant, punishing monthly premium. The agreement allowed the disgraced judge and his snobby wife to stay in the house, maintain their fake society image, and pretend to the entire world that they still owned the estate. They were not royalty. They were glorified, desperate tenants clinging to a lie to avoid public humiliation. I set my wine glass down on the desk, leaning closer to the monitors. My mind raced with absolute predatory focus. I needed to know who owned the holding company that had bailed them out. I needed to know who held the ultimate leash on Winston's massive, fragile ego. I ran a trace on the faceless LLC that purchased the foreclosed mansion. The corporate structure was intentionally complex, designed to hide the true owners behind a maze of dense legal fiction. The LLC was owned by a secondary subsidiary, which was managed by a tertiary management group based out of Delaware. But I had the best unmasking software in the global financial sector. I followed the paper trail, ruthlessly peeling back the layers of corporate shielding one by one, moving straight up the chain of command. The tertiary management group belonged to a massive parent corporation. The parent corporation was named Apex Pinnacle Holdings. I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I stared at the name on the screen, reading it over and over again, to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. A slow, genuine, and terrifying smile spread across my face. A sharp laugh bubbled up from my chest, echoing loudly in the empty, silent penthouse. Apex Pinnacle Holdings was not just any corporate conglomerate. It was the primary real estate acquisition arm of my own venture capital firm. My automated algorithms purchased thousands of distressed properties across the country every single year. The Buckhead mansion had simply been swallowed up by my software as a routine, profitable acquisition. Winston and Vivian were so financially insignificant to my bottom line that their grand estate was literally an automated rounding error in my portfolio. I had never even noticed I owned it. I looked out at the glittering city lights, the sheer beautiful poetry of the situation washing over me. Winston had stood in his dining room, his face purple with absolute rage, threatening to destroy me. He had promised to make me penniless and ensure I was begging on the streets. Vivian had screamed that I was an ungrateful nobody who owed them everything. Dion had tried to physically force me to sign away my future to save his fraudulent family. They had plotted to steal my modest suburban home because they believed they were the untouchable kings and queens of Atlanta. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea that the holding company they frantically wired their exorbitant rent checks to every single month belonged entirely to me. They had no idea that the roof over their heads, the manicured lawns they bragged about, and the grand mahogany doors they hid their dirty secrets behind were my personal property. I was not just the quiet, unassuming wife they planned to manipulate and discard. I was the literal owner of their entire existence. I was their landlord. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus back. He answered immediately. "Marcus," I said, staring at the property deed bearing my company name. "Draft an immediate notice to vacate for the Buckhead property leased under Apex Pinnacle Holdings. Terminate their lease agreement effective immediately due to hostile breach of contract." Tomorrow morning, I was going to serve them their eviction notice. I did not sleep that night. Sleep was a biological vulnerability I could no longer afford. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse command center, watching the sprawling Atlanta skyline transition from an inky, suffocating black to a bruised, violent purple. My mind was a hyperactive engine processing thousands of data points, legal statutes, and strategic maneuvers. By 7 in the morning, my forensic accounting team had successfully bypassed the final layer of encryption hiding Terrence's ultimate nightmare. They had located the exact entity holding his $2 million debt. They were not street-level thugs operating out of a damp basement or a gritty warehouse. They were a highly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous syndicate of shadow lenders who operated under the legitimate guise of a boutique private equity firm called Obsidian Capital. They laundered dirty money through high-interest short-term mezzanine loans, preying entirely on desperate, over-leveraged fools who wanted to play pretend in the high society sandbox. I instructed Marcus to arrange an immediate mandatory meeting at their downtown headquarters for 10 o'clock sharp. I took a scalding hot shower, washing away the lingering stench of the previous evening and the ghost of Dion fake affection. I bypassed the beige, forgettable, subservient dresses my husband always preferred. Instead, I pulled a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit from my private wardrobe. I paired it with a silk blouse and a pair of stilettos that echoed against the marble floors like precise, calculated gunshots. I was no longer playing the role of the meek, supportive wife. I was an apex predator stepping directly into the jungle. When I arrived at the Obsidian Capital high-rise, I did not wait for the receptionist to announce me. I bypassed the security desk, walked straight down the glass-paneled corridor, and pushed the heavy double doors of their executive boardroom wide open. 5 men sat around a massive, polished slate table. They wore custom Italian suits and expensive watches, but their eyes carried the cold, dead calculation of professional killers who had traded crowbars for fountain pens. The man at the head of the table, a silver-haired shark named Vance, looked up from his digital tablet. He frowned, clearly annoyed and momentarily disoriented by the sudden, uninvited intrusion. He opened his mouth to call for his security detail, but I beat him to the punch. I tossed a heavy leather-bound dossier onto the center of the slate table with a resounding, authoritative thud. It slid perfectly across the smooth surface, stopping exactly 2 inches from his porcelain coffee cup. You are holding $2 million in toxic, unrecoverable debt attached to a man named Terrence. I said, my voice echoing off the acoustic glass walls with absolute, uncompromising command. My name is Zuri, and I am the only reason the federal government is not currently freezing every single one of your offshore Cayman accounts. Sit down and listen very carefully. Vance stared at me, his eyes narrowing into dangerous, predatory slits. The men around him shifted in their ergonomic chairs, the atmosphere in the room instantly turning hostile and thick with implied violence. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I pulled out a chair opposite Vance and sat down smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands on the table. Terrence promised you a $2 million wire transfer by noon today, funded by a newly authorized home equity line of credit. I continued holding Vance's gaze hostage. That equity loan was tied directly to my personal property. I intercepted the fraudulent paperwork last night. The loan is entirely dead. Terrence is completely insolvent. He possesses 0 liquid assets. His leased luxury cars are pending immediate repossession, and his wife cosmetic company is a failing, heavily indebted shell corporation. You are holding a dead note. Vance leaned forward, his jaw tightening as the reality of his lost capital began to sink in. If Terrence defaults on his balloon payment today, we have highly effective alternative methods of extracting our capital, he said, his tone thick with a chilling, quiet menace. Your alternative methods are sloppy, loud, and bad for business. I countered, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute whisper. If you break his legs, intimidate his wife, or burn down his rented house, you immediately draw local police attention. If you draw police attention, they look at his chaotic finances. If they look at his finances, they find your unregulated routing numbers. You are exposing a $1 billion international laundering syndicate over a pathetic $2 million rounding error. You are significantly smarter than that, Vance. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and deafening. Vance realized in that exact second that he was not dealing with a desperate crying family member begging for her brother-in-law life. He was dealing with a bigger, far more dangerous corporate titan who had just walked into his territory and casually dismantled his leverage. "What is your specific proposal?" Vance asked, dropping the physical intimidation tactics and shifting instantly into business mode. "I am buying Terrence's debt," I stated flatly, "but I am absolutely not paying $2 million for a toxic, unrecoverable asset. I am offering you exactly $400,000 transferred via a secure cryptographic ledger within 60 seconds of your signature. You take a massive haircut on the principal, but you walk away with clean, instantly untraceable liquidity, and you completely sever your exposure to Terrence's impending federal indictment." The men at the table exchanged rapid, calculating glances. Vance stared directly into my eyes, weighing his options with mathematical precision. He knew I was entirely right. A dead or hospitalized man could not pay debts, and a loud, violent street-level collection would jeopardize their entire shadow operation. "400,000 is an insult to my firm," Vance growled, testing the waters. "It is a lifeline to your freedom." I corrected sharply, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Take it, or I walk out that door right now and send this comprehensive dossier to the FBI field office before my elevator reaches the lobby." Vance stared into my eyes, desperately searching for a bluff, a micro-expression of fear, or a hint of hesitation. He found nothing but absolute titanium resolve. He picked up his expensive gold fountain pen and pulled the debt transfer contract toward him. He signed his name with a swift, angry slash. I tapped the screen of my encrypted phone. Within 45 seconds, Vance's tablet chimed with the secure transfer confirmation. I slid the reassignment documents across the slate table. Vance signed every single page, legally transferring the entirety of Terrence's $2 million debt directly to Apex Pinnacle Holdings. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and collected the paperwork. I did not thank them. I simply turned and walked out of the boardroom. As the heavy glass doors swung closed behind me, a profound, terrifying thrill rushed through my veins. I did not just save Terrence from broken bones. I legally owned his entire existence. I returned to my penthouse command center just before noon. Marcus and his elite team of corporate litigators were already waiting for me in my primary server room. The massive monitors lining the walls were brightly illuminated with banking records, property deeds, shell company registrations, and wire transfer logs. We had transformed the luxury penthouse into a ruthless high-tech war room. It was time to manufacture the precise weapons for my absolute counterstrike. We started with Winston and Vivian. I stood directly over Marcus' shoulder as he drafted the legal eviction notice. Because the pompous former judge and his snobby wife had operated under a highly irregular private sale leaseback agreement to hide their catastrophic foreclosure 5 years ago, they had completely forfeited all standard tenant protections. Marcus drafted a brutal, uncompromising 72-hour notice to vacate the premises. We cited multiple hostile breaches of their commercial lease contract, including undisclosed financial liabilities, massive illicit gambling debts, and the illegal use of the property address for fraudulent loan applications. The legal language was clinical, razor-sharp, and utterly devoid of mercy. If they did not pack their designer bags and vacate my property within 3 days, heavily armed private security contractors would physically remove them and dump their expensive belongings onto the curb in front of all their wealthy, gossiping Buckhead neighbors. I printed the eviction notice on heavy bond paper and placed it carefully on the corner of my desk. Next was Dayon, the man who had smiled warmly in my face while actively plotting to steal my home, bankrupt my future, and file for a cowardly divorce. I instructed my legal team to draft the most aggressive ironclad divorce petition allowed under Georgia law. We claimed an at-fault divorce, citing extreme financial abuse, attempted felony fraud, and gross marital misconduct. But a simple divorce paper was not nearly enough punishment. I needed him entirely paralyzed. We drafted a comprehensive, immediate restraining order, locking him out of our suburban house, freezing his access to any shared physical property, and demanding he surrender his keys and vehicle immediately. We justified the restraining order using his unhinged physical assault at the dinner table the night before, noting the severe bruising on my right wrist where he had forcefully grabbed me. I had already severed his access to the digital money. Now I was legally severing him from the physical world we had built together. He was going to walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the gym bag he had carried out that morning. I printed the thick divorce petition and the restraining order, stacking them meticulously on top of the eviction notice. The final weapon required the most meticulous surgical preparation of all. Terrence had been running a massive sloppy wire fraud scheme to fund his fake cryptocurrency lifestyle and maintain the illusion of success. I unleashed my proprietary forensic accounting algorithms directly onto his digital footprint. My software scraped ruthlessly through his encrypted hard drives, his dummy shell corporations, and his offshore routing numbers. We compiled a massive airtight dossier detailing every single illegal transaction, every instance of money laundering, and every fraudulent investor pitch he had ever made. We cross-referenced his bank statements with the fake revenue reports Dominique had filed for her failing cosmetic line. They were both fully complicit in a multi-million-dollar federal crime. I did not just print a few summary pages. I printed a staggering 300-page masterclass in forensic financial destruction. I bound the dense dossier in a heavy black folder. On the front cover, I attached a bright yellow sticky note with the exact address of the local FBI field office and the direct contact information for the lead investigator of the white-collar crime division. I stood completely alone in the center of my penthouse, looking down at the neat, terrifying stack of documents resting on my granite desk. To the left, the 72-hour eviction notice that would render Winston and Vivian completely homeless and entirely humiliated. In the center, the brutal divorce papers and the restraining order that would instantly reduce Dion to a penniless ghost. To the right, the absolute ownership contract for Terrence's debt and the massive federal dossier that guaranteed he and Dominique would spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. I walked over to the mahogany hall closet and pulled out a sleek, hard-shell black briefcase. It was the exact same briefcase I had used to secure the fraudulent bank records just days ago. I opened the clasps, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet, sunlit room. I carefully lifted the stack of documents and placed them inside the velvet-lined interior. I arranged them perfectly, smoothing the sharp paper edges, ensuring every single weapon was locked, loaded, and ready for deployment. I closed the heavy lid of the briefcase and snapped the twin silver locks securely shut. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my penthouse. The meticulous preparation was complete. The trap was set. The ammunition was fully packed. I picked up the briefcase by its heavy leather handle, feeling the immense crushing weight of absolute power radiating through my arm. It was time to go home and execute my family. The drive away from the penthouse was the most peaceful commute of my entire life. I had effectively dismantled an entire family tree before dinner. I slept that night with the deep, uninterrupted rest of a conqueror. I did not go back to the suburban house. I checked into a luxury suite at the St. Regis under a corporate alias, turned off my primary phone, and let the automated slaughter run its course. By Wednesday morning, the invisible tripwires I had laid began to snap, striking their targets with lethal precision. Dion was holding court at a notoriously expensive luxury steakhouse in Buckhead. I knew his schedule intimately. Wednesday was his designated networking lunch. He was sitting in a circular leather booth surrounded by 3 mid-level executives he was desperately trying to recruit for a bogus investment scheme. He ordered the dry, aged tomahawk steaks, the imported oysters, and 2 bottles of vintage Bordeaux. He was playing the role of the master of the universe. When the heavy leather checkbook arrived, Dion casually reached into his tailored suit jacket and dropped his heavy platinum card onto the tray without even glancing at the total. He continued his arrogant monologue, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging down toward his neck. 5 minutes later, the polished waiter returned. The waiter leaned in close, his voice a discreet, practiced whisper. "I am terribly sorry, sir, but this card has been declined." Dion scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He blamed a bank error, a security flag for unusual spending, any convenient lie to save face in front of his guests. He pulled out a secondary gold card. It was a corporate card tied to his father-in-law firm. The waiter took it, walked away, and returned 2 minutes later. Declined again. The executives at the table stopped talking. The air in the booth grew thick and incredibly uncomfortable. Dion's face flushed a deep mottled red. He reached for his emergency debit card, the one tied to our joint checking account. The waiter swiped it at the table using a handheld terminal. Insufficient funds. The bright red error message blinked across the digital screen for everyone to see. Dion had absolutely nothing. His guests had to awkwardly pull out their own wallets to cover the exorbitant bill, exchanging glances of intense pity and disgust. Dion was forced to walk out of the restaurant completely stripped of his dignity, a fake millionaire who could not even afford a side salad. While Dion was choking on his public humiliation, Terrence was experiencing his own brand of sudden violent reality. At 7 in the morning, the quiet serenity of his upscale Alpharetta neighborhood was shattered by the heavy grinding roar of industrial diesel engines. Terrence woke up throwing off his high thread count sheets and stumbled to his massive front window. Parked aggressively at the end of his circular driveway were 3 heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks. Terrence rushed out the front door wearing nothing but a silk robe and panic. The repossession agents were burly, completely unbothered professionals who had dealt with fake rich people 1,000 times before. They were already attaching heavy steel winch cables to the axles of Terrence's twin matte black Lamborghinis. Terrence started screaming, waving his arms and demanding they stop. He threatened to call the police. He threatened to sue their company. He spouted nonsense about a temporary banking glitch and an incoming multi-million-dollar wire transfer. The lead repo agent simply handed Terrence a thick clipboard with the foreclosure and repossession orders highlighted in bright yellow ink. The bank had executed a total recall on all leased assets. Dominique appeared in the doorway clutching her robe, her face pale with absolute horror. Neighbors in adjacent mansions began opening their front doors, holding their morning coffees, openly staring at the spectacle. Terrence could only stand barefoot on the cold concrete driveway, completely impotent, as the hydraulic winches dragged his entire identity onto the back of the flatbeds. The trucks rolled away, leaving thick black tire marks on the pavement, and a crushing, terrifying silence in their wake. The illusion of the crypto king was completely shattered on his own driveway. Back in my hotel suite, I sat by the window in a plush bathrobe, drinking a perfectly steeped cup of Earl Grey tea. I turned on my primary phone. The device instantly vibrated violently in my hand, downloading an avalanche of missed communications. 142 missed calls, 78 text messages, 30 voicemails. The digital panic was a masterpiece of shifting tones, a symphony of destruction playing out exactly as I had orchestrated. I pressed play on the first voicemail. It was from Dion, left shortly after his humiliating lunch. His tone was furious, dripping with his usual entitled arrogance. "Turn the cards back on Zuri," Dion demanded, his voice echoing with false authority. "Stop playing games. I know you moved the money. This is entirely unacceptable. Transfer the funds back into the joint account right now, or there will be serious consequences when I get home." I deleted the message and skipped ahead to the 15th voicemail. The timeline had shifted to late afternoon. The caller was Vivian. She was practically vibrating with rage, her Southern belle composure completely shattered. "How dare you embarrass my son?" Vivian shrieked into the receiver. "Winston is furious. You are causing a massive scene over a simple family dispute. Turn the credit lines back on immediately. You are acting like a petulant child. You will fix this, Zuri, or I swear I will make sure you are exiled from every social circle in Atlanta." I took a sip of my tea, savoring the absolute delusion in her voice. She still thought she held the cards. She still believed her social standing meant anything to a woman who literally owned the roof over her head. I skipped forward again. Call 42 was from Terrence. His voice was breathless, manic, and entirely stripped of his usual smooth, talking bravado. "Zuri, they took the cars." Terrence panted, the sound of traffic in the background. "The bank accounts are locked. My broker cannot access the offshore funds. Everything is frozen. I need you to call me back right now. Winston says you have the money. We need the wire transfer, Zuri. Call me back. The final block of voicemails dropped all pretense of anger or authority. It was pure, unadulterated panic. By late Wednesday night, the absolute reality of their financial decapitation had fully set in. Dion had tried to go home to the suburban house only to find the biometric locks wiped and the security system blaring. He had tried to check into a hotel, but his name was blacklisted on every single account. Call 87 was Dion again, his voice trembling, broken and small. Zuri, please. He begged, the background noise indicating he was sitting in his car on the side of a road. I have no money for gas. The house alarm will not let me in. The private security company threatened to arrest me. I cannot reach Winston. What did you do? Please just pick up the phone. I am sorry about the dinner. Just tell me what you want. I listened to his pathetic whimpering and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, no lingering affection. The man I had married had never actually existed. He was just a parasite looking for a host, and I had permanently severed the feeding tube. I placed the phone flat on the desk and let it ring 20 more times. I ignored all 100+ calls. I let them sit in the dark, marinating in their own terror, realizing they were entirely powerless without my capital. I waited until Thursday morning to finally break the silence. I did not call them individually. I did not offer explanations, apologies, or demands. I opened the family group chat. The same chat thread Vivian used to organize her tedious holiday dinners, the same thread where they constantly praised Dion and Terrence, while entirely ignoring my existence. I stared at the blinking cursor, feeling the immense weight of the trap I was about to spring. I typed a single chilling text message and sent it to the entire family. I have the money to fix everything. Meet me at the church social on Sunday. Bring everyone. I turned the phone off, completely tossing it onto the hotel bed. I knew exactly how they would react. They were entirely blinded by their own limitless greed and their deeply ingrained narcissism. They would look at that text message and see a surrender. They would convince themselves that the quiet, submissive Zuri had simply thrown a temporary temper tantrum. They would assume the isolation had terrified me, that I had broken under the pressure of being away from their elite family, and that I was preparing to hand over the millions they desperately needed to survive. They would eagerly prepare their Sunday best. They would put on their fake smiles, their leased suits, and their costume jewelry. They would march into that crowded church social expecting to collect their ultimate prize and force me back into submission. They were walking straight into a public slaughterhouse, and they were smiling all the way to the chopping block. Sunday morning arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a Georgia summer, heavy and unyielding. The battleground was set at First African Citadel, the most exclusive elite black church in all of Atlanta. It was not simply a place of spiritual worship, it was the absolute epicenter of high society networking. Politicians, corporate executives, sitting judges, and legacy families gathered here every Sunday, not just to pray, but to see and be fiercely seen. The fellowship hall attached to the main sanctuary was a sprawling vaulted room featuring crystal chandeliers, polished oak floors, and acoustics designed for grand galas. Today, it was packed to absolute capacity for the annual spring social. Vivian was entirely in her element. She held court in the center of the room wearing a custom-tailored pastel yellow suit with a matching wide-brimmed hat. Her AKA sorority sisters surrounded her in a protective, gossiping sea of salmon pink and apple green. To the untrained eye, Vivian looked like the undisputed queen of the congregation. She laughed lightly, sipped her iced tea, and traded polite pleasantries with city council members. But I could see the cracks in her foundation from across the room. Her composure was entirely fake. She was masking the absolute clawing terror of the past 4 days behind her practiced pageant-winning smile. She genuinely believed my text message was a white flag of surrender. She thought I was arriving to grovel, to hand over the millions of dollars they so desperately needed, and to beg for my place back at her Sunday dinner table. Winston stood nearby chatting with a state senator, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like the bone might shatter under the pressure. Dion looked like a man who had not slept since Wednesday, because he had not. He wore a sharp navy suit, but the collar of his shirt was slightly unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew. He lacked his usual polished arrogance. His eyes darted frantically toward the main entrance every few seconds, waiting for his salvation to walk through the doors. Terence and Dominique stood near the catering tables, looking thoroughly exhausted and attempting to blend into the floral arrangements. I walked through the heavy double oak doors of the fellowship hall at exactly 1 in the afternoon. I did not wear the muted, conservative, forgettable dresses they always expected me to wear. I wore a striking crimson-red tailored suit that demanded absolute, uncompromising attention. My posture was flawless. I carried the sleek black briefcase in my left hand. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and polite networking dipped slightly as I entered the room. Vivian spotted me immediately. Her eyes flashed with a potent mixture of immense relief and vicious predatory triumph. She signaled to her sorority sisters, moving like a perfectly coordinated military unit to intercept my path. They closed ranks, cornering me near the front of the hall, right next to the elevated wooden stage where the pastor usually made his weekly community announcements. The stage was flanked by massive state-of-the-art audio speakers designed to project sound clearly to every corner of the massive room. Vivian stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space to assert her dominance. Her expensive floral perfume was cloying and desperate in the humid air. "You finally decided to act like an adult," Vivian whispered, her voice a lethal hiss, dripping with venom, carefully masked by a tight smile for the onlookers. "We have been completely humiliated this week, Zuri. The banks, the tow trucks, the frozen accounts. You threw a pathetic temper tantrum and it ends right now." She glanced around quickly to ensure her elite friends were watching her manage her unruly daughter-in-law. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. "It is time to publicly apologize to my son for your little tantrum, Zuri," Vivian commanded. "Do it right. Show some genuine respect for this family hand over the account transfers, and we might let you come home tonight." I looked at Vivian. I looked at the tight circle of wealthy, influential women hanging on her every word, waiting to watch me submit to the matriarch of the mighty family. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes in shame. I did not offer a single word of apology. I offered her a slow, predatory smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of an executioner verifying the identity of the condemned. I did not say a single word to her. I simply adjusted my firm grip on the handle of my black briefcase and stepped smoothly and deliberately around her. Vivian gasped softly, entirely unprepared for me to ignore a direct face-to-face command. She stumbled back a half step in pure shock. I walked straight past the circle of elite, whispering women and ascended the 3 carpeted steps to the main stage. The fellowship hall was still buzzing with hundreds of conversations, a dull, rolling roar of high society gossip and political maneuvering. No one had fully registered what was about to happen. I walked directly to the heavy wooden podium at the center of the stage. I set my black briefcase down on the polished wood with a solid, authoritative thud. The pastor's microphone was sitting in its stand, live and ready for the closing remarks of the social hour. I ignored the microphone for a moment and pulled my encrypted mobile phone from my suit pocket. Earlier that morning, I had paid the church audiovisual technician a highly motivating amount of cash to grant me full administrative access to the hall soundboard. I tapped a single pre-programmed macro button on my screen, pairing my device directly to the massive Bluetooth speaker system flanking the room. A low electronic hum echoed through the hall, signaling the successful digital hijacking. From the center of the room, Dion finally registered what was happening. He saw me standing confidently behind the podium. He saw the cold, lethal calculation radiating from my posture. The arrogant, comforting delusion that I was there to surrender evaporated from his mind in a violent, terrifying flash. He recognized the exact look in my eyes. It was the identical, unblinking stare I gave him right before I tore his fraudulent loan documents into confetti. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded across Dion's handsome face. "Zuri." "Get down from there," Dion shouted, his voice cracked with sheer terror slicing through the polite chatter of the room. He shoved past a city councilman, ignoring the shocked gasps of the church elders and the spilled drinks. He sprinted blindly toward the stage. His polished veneer was completely gone. He intended to physically drag me away from the podium. He intended to silence me with brute force, just like he had tried to do in his father's dining room. He thought physical intimidation could stop the avalanche. But I was not a victim, and I was absolutely not unprotected. I raised my right hand slightly, a silent, predetermined signal. From the shadows on either side of the stage, two massive men stepped forward into the harsh overhead lighting. They were not church ushers. They were not friendly deacons. They were highly trained, incredibly expensive private security contractors I had hired specifically for this exact moment. They wore dark, tailored suits and tactical earpieces, moving with terrifying speed and professional precision. As Dion tried to vault up the carpeted stairs, the lead guard stepped directly into his path. The guard planted a massive, unyielding hand squarely on Dion's chest. Dion hit the guard like he had run full speed into a titanium wall. The impact bounced him violently backward. He stumbled awkwardly, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the carpet, and crashed onto his back. His perfectly styled hair fell into his panicked eyes. He scrambled backward like a frightened child. "Do not touch her!" Dion screamed, completely losing his mind, in front of the most powerful people in the city. "Zuri, stop this right now. Do not do this." The entire fellowship hall fell deathly silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The political networking ceased entirely. 500 pairs of eyes turned toward the stage, completely captivated and horrified by the sudden, unprecedented drama unfolding at their elegant social. Politicians, judges, and socialites stared in stunned, breathless fascination. Winston's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly grayish white. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth hanging open in silent, paralyzed horror. Terrence took a slow, deliberate step backward, toward the nearest exit, his survival instincts finally kicking in. I looked down at my husband, struggling uselessly on the floor against a man twice his size. I looked out at the sea of faces, the elite society that had actively looked down on me for a decade, the people who worshipped the ground this fraudulent family walked on. I leaned directly into the microphone. The acoustics in the room were flawless. I tapped the screen of my phone. The audio files were perfectly queued up. The evidence of their massive systemic fraud, their desperate voicemails, and their unhinged threats was ready to be broadcast to the entire room. I looked directly into Vivian, terrified, widening eyes. I tapped play. The first crackle of static lasted only a fraction of a second before Winston's booming, unmistakable baritone filled the vaulted fellowship hall. The acoustic design of the church amplified his voice with terrifying clarity. He was not reciting a scripture or delivering a pious community address. He was outlining a felony. His recorded voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, detailing exactly how to fabricate collateral to secure a fraudulent home equity line of credit. He instructed Dion on which corrupt appraiser to use, specifically naming the bank executive they needed to bribe to push the paperwork past the underwriting committee. The congregation of politicians, legacy families, and sitting judges froze. Forks hovered halfway to mouths, iced tea glasses stopped midair. Then the audio shifted seamlessly to Terrence. His voice lacked any of his usual crypto bro bravado. He sounded wet, pathetic, and entirely terrified. He begged Winston for a bailout, openly sobbing as he confessed to owing $2 million to a violent underground syndicate. He admitted his luxury cars were leased, his investment fund was a complete Ponzi scheme, and Dominique Cosmetic brand was nothing but a money laundering front to hide his failing debts. The sheer desperation in his recorded voice was physically repulsive. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. I watched Dominique's face drain of all color, her knees buckling slightly as the surrounding church members took a synchronized, horrified step away from her. But the absolute killing blow belonged to Dion. My husband's smooth, practiced voice purred from the massive speakers, dripping with a vicious, calculating malice no one in this room had ever heard before. He laughed as he outlined his master plan. He explained exactly why he had married me. He called me a gullible, unpedigreed mark, a useful idiot with a steady income who could quietly fund his lifestyle while he maintained his elite social standing. The entire church listened in stunned silence as Dion happily detailed his strategy to illegally siphon my personal accounts, transfer my assets into a hidden shell corporation, and then discard me with absolutely nothing. He bragged about his financial abuse as if it were a competitive sport. The audio recording was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. It laid bare the rotten, decaying core of their entire dynasty. I tapped the screen of my phone, killing the Bluetooth connection. The sudden silence in the massive fellowship hall was heavier than concrete. It pressed down on the room, thick with absolute shock and total social devastation. The fallout was instantaneous and beautiful to witness. Vivian carefully cultivated empire evaporated before my eyes. The tight protective circle of her sorority sisters physically recoiled. The women in salmon pink and apple green exchanged looks of profound disgust, actively stepping away from Vivian as if her pastel yellow suit had suddenly caught fire. She reached out to grab her closest friend's arm, but the woman yanked her hand away, turning her back completely. Winston attempted to salvage his dignity. He puffed out his chest and marched toward a fellow superior court judge standing near the buffet table, opening his mouth to spin a lie. The judge simply held up a single hand, shook his head in absolute disgust, and walked out the side door. The politicians who had spent the last hour kissing Winston Ring suddenly found the floor fascinating, scattering toward the exits to avoid being photographed anywhere near the disgraced patriarch. Their social currency, hoarded and polished for decades, was entirely worthless. The perfect family had just been unmasked as a cartel of common scammers, predators, and desperate frauds. I disconnected my phone, picked up my sleek black briefcase, and descended the 3 carpeted steps of the stage. My heels clicked with lethal precision against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted for me immediately, creating a wide, respectful aisle. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared breathe. I walked straight over to Dion. He was still sprawled awkwardly on the floor, restrained by the sheer intimidating presence of my private security detail. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and pooling with panicked tears. The arrogant man who had tried to physically force me to sign away my life was completely broken. I reached into the open briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I leaned down and slapped the heavy divorce petition directly onto his chest. He flinched at the impact. "You are served, Dion," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Those are at-fault divorce papers accompanied by an emergency court-ordered restraining order. You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my residence, my office, or my person. Your access to the house has been revoked. Your financial accounts have been permanently severed. You are walking out of this church with absolutely nothing but the suit on your back." He stared at the papers resting on his chest, his mouth opening and closing in mute, suffocating horror. He could not form a single word. I pivoted sharply, my gaze locking onto Terrence. He was actively trying to escape, edging backward toward the main entrance, pulling a hyperventilating Dominique by the wrist. "Stop right there, Terrence," I commanded. The lethal weight of my voice froze him dead in his tracks. I walked toward him, the crowd backing away to give me a wide berth. Terrence began to visibly sweat, his expensive collar soaked, his hands trembling violently. I pulled the second stack of files from my briefcase, the massive financial dossier containing his entire criminal history. I did not hand it to him. I dropped it unceremoniously at his expensive leather shoes. It hit the floor with a heavy, satisfying thud. "By the way, Terrence, your creditors sold your debt to me," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "And the FBI received your crypto fraud files an hour ago." Terrence's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor right beside the dossier, burying his face in his hands as a loud guttural sob ripped from his throat. Dominique screamed, covering her face as she stumbled away from her ruined husband. They were completely finished. The air in the fellowship hall crackled with the electric shock of pure destruction. I stood victorious among the wreckage of their lives, watching the mighty family burn to ashes. I had meticulously dismantled their finances, their reputations, and their freedom. I had executed a flawless surgical strike that left them with absolutely no avenues of escape. Suddenly, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek shattered the silence. Vivian shoved her way past her former friends, her pastel yellow hat knocked askew, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged venom. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. She refused to accept defeat. Her profound delusion overrode her basic survival instincts. Vivian's chest heaved with ragged, furious breaths. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, silently demanding that anyone step forward and defend her honor. She looked toward the church elders, the very men Winston had played golf with for a decade. They actively averted their gaze, suddenly deeply fascinated by the intricate patterns woven into the carpet. She looked toward the prominent politicians who had eagerly attended her lavish fundraisers. They were already slipping out the side doors, placing urgent calls to their public relations managers to scrub any association with the disgraced family. The isolation was absolute. Vivian was a queen standing in an empty court commanding an army that had completely deserted her. Yet the delusion persisted. She took a step toward me, her hands balled into tight fists, her knuckles turning white. "You think playing a few spliced audio clips changes who we are?" Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a desperate, manic denial. "We are an institution in this city. You are just a temporary mistake Dion made, a clerical error we are going to erase. Winston will call the bank commissioner tomorrow. We will have your little accounts frozen. We will have you dragged through civil court until you cannot afford the legal fees. You think you can walk into my church, humiliate my bloodline, and just walk away? We are going back to our estate, and we are going to mobilize every single resource we have to crush you into dust." I let her rant. I let the poison spill from her lips, allowing every single person remaining in that fellowship hall to witness the true, unfiltered ugliness of the woman they had previously idolized. She was burying herself deeper with every word, completely unaware that she was threatening me with weapons I had already confiscated. Winston finally found his voice. He pushed through the crowd, standing beside his hysterical wife. His imposing stature had vanished. He looked hollowed out, a deflated balloon of a man. But he still tried to play the role of the intimidating judge. "This is highly illegal, Zuri," Winston barked, pointing a thick finger at the audio equipment on the stage. "Wiretapping, corporate espionage, defamation. You have absolutely no idea the legal firestorm you have just initiated. I will personally see to it that you are indicted by the end of the week." I looked at the disgraced judge. He was threatening me with a legal system he no longer had any influence over. His gambling debts had compromised him completely, and the local prosecutors were already reviewing the anonymous tip I had forwarded regarding his illicit offshore transfers. He was a dead man threatening to haunt a house he no longer owned. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice carrying a lethal, icy calm that sliced directly through their frantic blustering. Vivian opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the absolute terrifying stillness in my posture made her hesitate. The frantic energy in the room seemed to stall, hanging suspended in the humid air as everyone waited for my response. The congregation watched in rapt silence, witnessing a masterclass in total annihilation. I turned my back on them for a fraction of a second. I walked to the table where my briefcase sat open, exposing the velvet-lined interior. My hand hovered over the final, meticulously prepared document, resting at the bottom. This was the kill shot. This was the piece of paper that would completely shatter the very foundation of their arrogance. "You malicious witch," Vivian screamed again, unable to tolerate the silence. "We still have our name and our home. We will ruin you." I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled the crisp, heavy bond paper from the velvet lining of the briefcase. I turned around and walked slowly back to the edge of the stage, holding the document out so the bright chandelier light caught its stark, undeniable legal seal. Vivian stared at it, her chest heaving, refusing to take it from my hand. I let it flutter gently from my fingertips. It landed face up perfectly at the tips of her expensive designer pumps. "You do not own that estate, Vivian," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing coldly through the paralyzed fellowship hall. "You have not owned it for 5 years. It was quietly foreclosed on when Winston gambling debts first spiraled out of control. You arranged a highly irregular private sale leaseback agreement to hide your catastrophic financial failure from your elite friends. My firm bought that exact holding company last month. I am legally your landlord, Vivian, and you are currently 90 days delinquent on your rent." Vivian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked down at the paper, reading the bold, unmistakable heading printed across the top. 72-hour notice to vacate. You have exactly 3 days to pack whatever leased furniture you can fit into a moving truck and vacate my property. I continued, making sure my voice carried to the absolute back of the hall. If you are not gone by Wednesday morning, heavily armed private security contractors will physically remove you and dump your belongings onto the curb in front of all your wealthy, gossiping Buckhead neighbors. Winston staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a freight train. He clutched his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple as the absolute destruction of his judicial legacy finally registered. He was a total fraud, a destitute gambler exposed in front of the entire political establishment he had spent his life courting. The very people he had tried to impress were now actively recording his downfall on their smartphones. Before Vivian could even attempt to process her impending homelessness, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere. The sharp, unmistakable wail of police sirens echoed from the street outside. Heavy boots pounded against the marble foyer of the church. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent crash. 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the FBI logo stormed into the fellowship hall. They bypassed the fleeing politicians, ignored the screaming choir members, and marched straight toward Terrence. He did not run. He simply stayed on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, as the agents hauled him to his feet and violently snapped cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. Dominique backed away, screaming hysterically, realizing she was inextricably linked to a multi-million-dollar federal money laundering indictment. The illusion of their lavish crypto lifestyle was ending in the back of a federal transport vehicle. I stepped down from the stage and walked purposefully down the center aisle, heading straight for the exit. Dion was still on the floor, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his fake life. As I approached, he scrambled to his knees. He grabbed the hem of my crimson skirt, his face wet with tears and sweat. "Zuri, please." Dion begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I am sorry, I will do anything. Just give me another chance, I cannot live like this." I stopped for a fraction of a second. I looked down at the man who had actively plotted to steal my future while smiling in my face. I gently, firmly pulled the fabric of my skirt from his trembling fingers. I did not say a single word. I simply stepped past him, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic march toward the exit, leaving the entire family to burn in the inferno of their own making. 6 months later, the air in Atlanta had turned crisp with the arrival of autumn. I stood on the sprawling terrace of my penthouse command center, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea in my hand, looking out over the glittering, expanding skyline of a city I practically owned. The chaos of the spring was a distant, highly profitable memory. My corporate acquisitions had doubled. My personal peace was absolute, and the cancerous rot of my past had been surgically removed. Dion was currently living in a dingy hourly motel just off the interstate. His credit was entirely destroyed. His reputation in the corporate world was radioactive, and he was working as a mid-level sales rep for a failing logistics company, desperately trying to pay the mounting legal fees from our brutal, uncompromising divorce. He walked away with absolutely nothing but the cheap suit he wore to court. Vivian and Winston were completely exiled from Atlanta high society. They had been physically evicted from the estate, exactly as I had promised. They now rented a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a forgotten working-class suburb. Winston had been forced into an early, disgraced retirement to avoid federal prosecution, and Vivian spent her days hiding indoors, utterly terrified of running into any of her former sorority sisters at the local discount grocery store. Her crown had been completely stripped. Terrence was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and money laundering. Dominique had managed to avoid prison by completely turning state evidence against her own husband, but her fake cosmetic empire was dissolved entirely, leaving her heavily indebted and working a minimum-wage retail job at the local mall. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the immense, unyielding power of absolute freedom. They had mistaken my quiet support for weakness. They had assumed my kindness was a vulnerability they could exploit. They built their entire fraudulent kingdom on my back, completely unaware that I had the power to shatter their foundation with a single calculated strike. Never let anyone convince you that your silence is permission for their abuse. Never let a partner, a family member, or an elite circle of frauds make you their designated scapegoat. You have to know your exact worth, and you must be willing to burn down the entire table if they refuse to give you the seat you earned. When they try to bury you, you do not just survive, you buy the dirt. You buy the shovels and you legally evict them from your life forever. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic people who tried to use you for their own financial or social gain? How did you take your power back and rebuild your life entirely on your own terms? Share your stories of absolute triumph in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming respect resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of unapologetic revenge, and remember that your peace is worth protecting at all costs.